Miles Davis never explained why he recorded Kind of Blue, until a letter discovered in 2019 revealed the woman who inspired history's greatest jazz album. For 60 years, music historians, critics, and fans believe that Kind of Blue emerged from pure musical genius and innovative harmonic exploration. Everyone talked about the revolutionary modal approach, the spontaneous recording sessions, the incredible lineup of musicians, but nobody knew about the heartbreak and the lost love that actually drove Miles to create his masterpiece. The letter was found in a storage unit in Harlem that had belonged to Miles's estate, tucked inside an old trumpet case that hadn't been opened since his death in 1991. Written in Miles's unmistakable handwriting, dated March 2, 1959, exactly 17 days before the Kind of Blue recording sessions began, the letter was addressed to a woman named Elena Castellanos, a Spanish dancer who had disappeared from Miles's life as suddenly and mysteriously as she had entered it. The letter contained words that would shock the jazz world. "Elena, you said I could never capture in music what you made me feel when you danced. You said jazz was too cold, too intellectual, too distant from the heart. Tomorrow I go into the studio to prove you wrong. I'm going to record the sound of how you moved through my life. Blue like the sadness of losing you, but also blue like the depth of water where light becomes something else entirely." This is the story of how the woman who broke Miles Davis's heart became the secret muse behind the album that would define jazz for generations, and how a love affair that lasted only 4 months created musical magic that has lasted for more than 60 years. It was November 1958, and Miles Davis was at the peak of his artistic powers, but struggling with a personal emptiness that success couldn't fill. He had achieved everything that a jazz musician could dream of: critical acclaim, commercial success, a legendary quintet, and recognition as one of the most innovative artists in American music. But despite his professional triumphs, Miles felt disconnected from the emotional core that had originally drawn him to music. The jazz world in 1958 was dominated by complex harmonic progressions and technical virtuosity. Bebop had evolved into hard bop, which had grown increasingly sophisticated and intellectually demanding. While Miles appreciated the musical advancement, he had begun to feel that jazz was losing touch with its emotional foundation, becoming more about demonstrating knowledge than expressing truth. Miles had been experimenting with modal approaches that simplified harmonic structures while creating more space for emotional expression. He believed that music should move people's hearts before it impressed their minds, but he was struggling to find the artistic breakthrough that would allow him to fully realize this vision. That November evening, Miles was walking through Greenwich Village after a recording session when he heard music drifting from a small basement club called El Flamenco. The sound was unlike anything in his usual musical environment. Passionate, raw, deeply emotional guitar, accompanied by rhythmic hand clapping and the sharp, staccato sound of dancing feet. Curious about this unfamiliar music, Miles descended the narrow stairs into the dimly lit club. The space was small and intimate, with perhaps 30 people seated at small tables surrounding a tiny stage. On that stage, a Spanish guitarist was playing with an intensity that commanded complete attention, while a woman in a traditional flamenco dress moved with a combination of grace and power that took Miles' breath away. The dancer was Elena Castellanos, a 26-year-old from Seville who had come to New York to pursue her artistic dreams. She had been dancing since childhood, trained in the classical traditions of flamenco, but her style incorporated a modern sensibility that made the ancient art form feel contemporary and urgent. As Miles watched Elena dance, he experienced something he hadn't felt in years: pure, unfiltered emotional connection to artistic expression. Her movements seemed to bypass his intellectual defenses and speak directly to his heart. The way she interpreted the guitar's rhythms, the way she used silence and space as much as movement and sound, the way she seemed to channel emotions too deep for words, all of this resonated with the musical ideas he had been struggling to articulate. During a break between sets, Miles approached Elena and introduced himself. She recognized his name from records she had heard, but she wasn't particularly impressed by his fame. When he complimented her dancing and suggested they might collaborate musically, she politely declined. "Jazz and flamenco don't mix," Elena said in accented but perfect English. "Your music is too intellectual, too cold. Flamenco comes from the heart, from pain and passion. Jazz comes from the head." This dismissal should have ended their interaction, but instead it intrigued Miles. Nobody had ever suggested that his music lacked emotional depth, and he found himself returning to El Flamenco night after night, ostensibly to hear the music, but actually to watch Elena dance and to engage her in conversations that challenged his understanding of artistic expression. Over the following weeks, Miles and Elena developed a relationship that was part artistic mentorship, part intellectual sparring match, and increasingly part romantic attraction. Elena would critique jazz as emotionally distant and overly complex, while Miles would argue that sophisticated harmonic structures could enhance rather than diminish emotional expression. Their relationship deepened through long conversations about art, music, culture, and the nature of authentic expression. Elena shared stories about flamenco's origins in the suffering and resilience of Spanish gypsies, while Miles talked about jazz's roots in African American experiences of pain and transcendence. Despite their different backgrounds, they discovered shared artistic values, a commitment to honesty and expression, a belief that art should transform both performer and audience, and a conviction that technique should serve emotion rather than dominate it. By December 1958, Miles and Elena had become lovers, and their relationship was profoundly influencing his approach to music. Elena's emphasis on emotional directness and her ability to create complex artistic statements through seemingly simple means were inspiring Miles to reconsider his own musical methods. Elena would attend Miles's performances and offer critiques that were both supportive and challenging. She appreciated his technical mastery, but encouraged him to trust his emotional instincts more completely. She suggested that he was sometimes hiding behind harmonic complexity when simpler approaches might be more powerful. "You play like you're afraid of being vulnerable," she told him after one performance. "Great art requires courage, the courage to show who you really are, not just how much you know." These conversations were transforming Miles's artistic vision. He began experimenting with modal approaches that emphasized emotional atmosphere over harmonic movement, creating musical spaces where feeling could develop and expand without being constrained by complex chord progressions. Elena's influence extended beyond philosophical discussions to specific musical techniques. Her understanding of rhythm, particularly the way flamenco used silence and space as expressive elements, helped Miles develop new approaches to phrasing and timing. Most importantly, Elena was inspiring Miles to reconnect with the emotional experiences that had originally motivated him to become a musician. Through their relationship, he was rediscovering the pain, longing, joy, and transcendence that made music meaningful beyond its technical achievements. However, their relationship also contained the seeds of its own destruction. Elena was fiercely independent and had come to America to build her own artistic career, not to become anyone's muse or romantic accessory. As Miles's influence on her life increased, she began to feel that her own artistic identity was being overshadowed. The crisis came in February 1959, when Elena was offered an opportunity to join a flamenco company that was touring Europe. The tour would last 8 months and include performances in Madrid, Paris, and Rome, a chance to establish her reputation on an international level. Miles asked Elena not to take the tour, suggesting that they could create something artistically significant together if she remained in New York. But Elena saw this request as an attempt to limit her artistic independence for the sake of their relationship. "You want me to be your inspiration," she told him during their final argument. "But I didn't come to America to inspire someone else's art. I came to create my own." Elena left New York in late February 1959, and she and Miles never spoke again. Her departure devastated Miles in ways that surprised him with their intensity. He realized that he had fallen in love not just with Elena as a person, but with the artistic possibilities that their relationship had opened up for him. The letter that was discovered in 2019 was written during the weeks following Elena's departure, when Miles was preparing for the recording sessions that would produce Kind of Blue. In it, he poured out his feelings about their relationship and his determination to prove that jazz could achieve the emotional depth and direct impact that Elena had attributed exclusively to flamenco. "You challenged everything I believed about music," Miles wrote. "You forced me to choose between being safe and being honest. The album I'm about to record is my answer to your challenge. Every note will be searching for the feeling you brought to my life and then took away." The Kind of Blue recording sessions, which took place on March 2nd and April 22nd, 1959, were indeed different from any recording sessions Miles had done before. Instead of complex arrangements and predetermined harmonic structures, he provided his musicians with simple modal sketches and encouraged them to explore emotional possibilities within those frameworks. The resulting music captured exactly what Elena had challenged him to achieve: jazz that was intellectually sophisticated but emotionally direct, music that demonstrated technical mastery while remaining accessible to listeners who cared more about feeling than analysis. Tracks like "So What" and "Blue and Green" embodied the synthesis of simplicity and sophistication that Elena had advocated. The album's use of space, its emphasis on mood over movement, and its ability to convey complex emotions through seemingly simple means, all reflected the artistic lessons that Miles had learned from watching Elena dance. The discovery of the letter in 2019 provided missing context for understanding both the artistic breakthrough represented by Kind of Blue and the personal journey that made that breakthrough possible. Music historians began re-examining the album's composition and recording process, finding evidence of flamenco influences that had previously been overlooked. The rhythmic approaches used in several tracks showed subtle influences from Spanish music, while the album's emphasis on emotional atmosphere over harmonic complexity reflected the artistic philosophy that Elena had championed during their brief relationship. Research into Elena's own career revealed that she had indeed achieved the international success she had sought. She performed with major flamenco companies throughout Europe and South America, eventually establishing her own dance school in Barcelona. She never married and rarely gave interviews about her personal life, maintaining the privacy and independence that had characterized her relationship with Miles. In one of the few interviews she granted, given to a Spanish arts magazine in 1995, Elena was asked if she had ever regretted leaving New York in 1959. Her answer was cryptic but telling. "I came to America to learn what I could about artistic freedom. I learned more than I expected, but freedom sometimes requires choosing what you leave behind as much as what you take with you." She died in Barcelona in 2003, and her obituary made no mention of her relationship with Miles Davis. To the end, she maintained the separation between her public artistic identity and her private personal experiences that had characterized her entire career. The revelation about Elena's influence on Kind of Blue sparked debates among music historians about the role of personal relationships in artistic creation. Some scholars argued that knowing about the romantic inspiration behind the album enhanced understanding of its emotional power, while others worried that focusing on Miles's love life trivialized the musical achievements that made the album significant. Musicians and artists responded to the story with particular interest, recognizing in Miles and Elena's relationship the kind of artistic catalyst that could transform creative work. Many performers shared their own stories about relationships that had inspired breakthrough artistic moments, creating a broader conversation about the connection between personal experience and creative expression. The letter also provided insight into Miles's personality and emotional life that had previously been hidden from public view. Known for his often difficult and distant public persona, Miles revealed in his writing to Elena a vulnerability and romantic sensitivity that few people had ever witnessed. Contemporary jazz musicians found inspiration in the story's demonstration that even the most revolutionary artistic breakthroughs often emerge from deeply personal experiences. The idea that Kind of Blue had been motivated by heartbreak and the desire to prove artistic worth added human dimension to an album that had sometimes been discussed in purely technical terms. Music educators began using the Miles and Elena story to help students understand the importance of emotional authenticity in artistic expression. The story illustrated how technical mastery and emotional depth could reinforce rather than contradict each other, and how personal relationships could catalyze artistic growth. The Spanish flamenco community also responded with interest to the revelation of Elena's influence on one of America's greatest musical achievements. Flamenco artists found validation in the story's suggestion that their art form's emphasis on emotional directness had contributed to jazz's evolution toward greater expressive freedom. The letter's discovery also raised questions about what other personal documents might be hidden in archives and storage facilities, waiting to reveal new dimensions of musical history. Scholars began more systematic searches through musicians' estates, hoping to uncover similar insights into the personal experiences that had shaped artistic achievements. For fans of Kind of Blue, the Elena story added a new layer of meaning to an album that many already considered perfect. Knowing that songs like Blue and Green had been inspired by a specific lost love gave the music additional emotional resonance without diminishing its artistic sophistication. The story also served as a reminder that great art often emerges from the intersection of personal experience and artistic technique. Miles's ability to transform his heartbreak into musical innovation demonstrated the kind of emotional courage that Elena had challenged him to develop. 60 years after its recording, Kind of Blue continues to move listeners who know nothing about Elena Castellanos or Miles's personal struggles. But for those who do know the story, the album becomes something even more remarkable. Proof that the greatest artistic achievements often come from artists who are willing to risk everything, including their hearts, in pursuit of authentic expression. The musical techniques that Miles developed during his relationship with Elena became foundational elements of modal jazz and influenced generations of musicians. The emphasis on emotional atmosphere over harmonic complexity, the use of space and silence as expressive tools, and the integration of simplicity with sophistication all reflected lessons learned from watching Elena dance. The recording process for Kind of Blue reflected Elena's influence in ways that weren't apparent until the letter's discovery. Miles's decision to provide his musicians with minimal written material and encourage them to explore emotional possibilities rather than execute complex arrangements directly paralleled the spontaneous, emotionally driven approach that characterized flamenco performance. So What, with its simple two-chord structure and emphasis on modal exploration, embodied Elena's belief that profound artistic statements could emerge from seemingly basic materials when performed with emotional authenticity. Blue and Green takes on new meaning when understood as Miles's musical portrait of his relationship with Elena. The album's famous recording history, particularly the fact that most tracks were completed in just 2 takes, can now be seen as reflecting Elena's emphasis on emotional immediacy over technical perfection. Miles's willingness to capture spontaneous musical moments rather than craft elaborate arrangements represented a fundamental shift in his artistic approach. The commercial and critical success that Kind of Blue achieved vindicated Elena's belief that emotionally direct music could reach broader audiences without sacrificing artistic integrity. The album's ability to appeal to both jazz aficionados and casual listeners proved that sophisticated music didn't need to be emotionally distant. Jazz education was transformed by Kind of Blue's approach to modal harmony and its demonstration that musical complexity could serve emotional expression rather than dominate it. Music schools began teaching the album's techniques not just as theoretical concepts, but as examples of how personal artistic vision could reshape entire musical genres. The influence of Elena's artistic philosophy extended far beyond the specific techniques used in Kind of Blue. Her emphasis on emotional courage, vulnerability, and authentic expression became central principles in Miles's approach to all his subsequent music, from his acoustic work through his later electric explorations. The story of Miles and Elena also illuminated the international cultural exchanges that shaped American jazz during the late 1950s. Elena's flamenco background brought Spanish and gypsy musical traditions into contact with African American jazz innovations, creating cross-cultural artistic synthesis. The letter revealed that Miles had continued to think about Elena throughout his career, even though they never reconnected. Several passages suggested that he measured his artistic achievements against the standards she had set, always asking whether his music achieved the emotional depth she had challenged him to pursue. The rediscovery of Elena's story also inspired renewed interest in the role of women in jazz history, particularly women whose contributions had been overlooked by male-dominated historical narratives. Elena's influence on Kind of Blue demonstrated that important artistic developments often resulted from collaborations that weren't formally recognized. Contemporary musicians found inspiration in the story's demonstration that artistic breakthroughs often emerged from personal relationships that challenged established ways of thinking and creating. The Miles and Elena story became a model for how romantic partnerships could serve as catalysts for creative growth. The emotional authenticity that Elena had demanded from Miles became a touchstone for evaluating artistic achievement across all genres. Musicians began asking whether their work met the standard of emotional honesty that she had represented, using her influence on Kind of Blue as an example. The international reach of Kind of Blue's influence meant that Elena's artistic philosophy, transmitted through Miles' music, had affected musical development worldwide. Jazz musicians globally had absorbed the album's lessons about emotional directness and modal exploration, spreading Elena's influence far beyond flamenco. For contemporary jazz musicians, the Elena story provided validation that emotional authenticity was as important as technical mastery in creating significant artistic work. Young musicians found encouragement in the demonstration that personal relationships could be sources of creative inspiration. The legacy of Elena's influence on Miles extended beyond Kind of Blue to affect his entire subsequent career. Albums like Sketches of Spain, with its exploration of Spanish musical traditions, and his later electric work, with its emphasis on emotional atmosphere, all showed traces of her artistic principles. The enduring popularity of Kind of Blue, more than 60 years after its recording, testified to the lasting power of the emotional authenticity that Elena had demanded from Miles. The album's ability to continue moving new generations of listeners proved that music created with genuine emotional commitment could transcend its historical moment to achieve timeless significance. If this story of hidden love, artistic inspiration, and how heartbreak created the greatest jazz album ever recorded moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with any music lover who appreciates the personal stories behind artistic masterpieces. Anyone who understands how love can inspire creativity, or anyone who believes that best art comes from deepest human experiences. Have you ever been inspired to create something because of a relationship that changed your perspective?